Hello, Warbirders. Uh-oh. No opening music. So you know that something is different today. It's been a little while, so I thought I would reintroduce Tanner to you. She is a third-generation operational Air Force pilot and one of a very select group of women who fly the F-35 Lightning II. And more importantly, she's a long-time listener to World of Warbirds. In the early days, she would hound me about doing something more modern. And so I deflected by challenging her to write an episode herself. Well, she accepted the challenge. And you could find her episodes in my list under Tanner's Just Jetz. For security reasons, she can't narrate her stuff at this point, so I will read it to you. So Tanner, as pilots say to each other in the cockpit, you have control. It's the 1991 Gulf War, and you are an Iraqi Navy missile specialist. You do the job to help keep food on the table for you, and hopefully future generations to come, by getting your family name in good graces with the government by serving. Being a missile specialist, at this site you operate specifically the HY-2 Silkworm missile, a land-based missile made for taking out ships. And on this day, you sit on the coast. Your mission... Hello and welcome to Tanner's Just Jetz. Today we're actually covering a jet. I wanted to work my way up to this one, to bring out the history of its predecessors, but also slowly work our way through the innovations of tech in the anti-submarine warfare realm. Like I said in the last episode, and we'll say again in this one, the S-2 Tracker is a great plane, and the Navy loved it. In fact, I recommend you go back and give that episode a listen first, if you haven't, as I'll be building off many concepts mentioned in that episode. Sorry guys, this one took so long. Been having a lot going on in my life lately, and this episode is a long one, which gave me some writer's block. But it's definitely a tale that needs to be told to the best of one's abilities. The first S-2A Tracker flight was in 1952. 20 years after some great service and great use due to the evolutions of submarine technology, the plane was rapidly aging and needed a new, modern replacement. Meanwhile, the Soviets were building up their force of subs. In 1960, an intelligence report stated that the Soviets had up to 2,000 modern diesel-electric submarines. At the end of World War II, they had captured a German Type 21 U-boat, the newest model, but put into service too late in the war, only serving one patrol. But it had a new pressure hull construction, powerful sonar, a partially automatic torpedo loader, and able to travel at 35 knots, and able to travel for 1,700 nautical miles surface range or 240 submerged. The main thing the Soviet Union was able to learn from this captured piece, though, was the new methods of construction, leading to much faster production by pre-assembling parts of the sub in factories. The limit of the early German diesel-electric submarines was fuel. In 1958, this would change as the Soviets sent to sea their first nuclear submarine, Project 672 Kit, or known by its NATO name, November. This was the first of a class of nuclear submarines known by the Soviets as the Lit, or Whale in English, and they served until 1990. 14 subs were made in this class, and many have accomplishments. But you can read up on those on your own, because this is Tanner's Just Jetz, not Tanner's Just Subs. As the Vietnam War came closer to its last years, most propeller-driven planes on the aircraft carrier had been phased out, except for the S-2 Tracker, its sister, the C-1 Trader, and the E-2 Hawkeye. The carriers were getting sick of having to haul around a bunch of avgas to keep the birds flying, and as the World War II era carriers retired, this situation did not improve. As a result, the surface anti-submarine warfare network had to be reframed, and one first change they looked at was replacing the S-2 tracker. The proposal issued in 1968 aimed specifically at a carrier-borne replacement of the S-2 tracker called the VSX, aka Heavier Than Air Anti-Submarine Experimental. To simplify it, take the S-2, make it a jet, and double everything. Some requirements were that it had to double the speed of the S-2, 560 miles per hour, double the max ceiling, 44,000 feet, and twice the range, 2,700 nautical miles. Of course, you say aircraft carrier and Grumman's gonna come calling, the creator of our two previous carrier-borne anti-submarine warfare birds. They teamed up with Convair to put in a proposal, but Lockheed, the creators of another great anti-submarine warfare platform, the P-3 Orion, put in a proposal also. Lockheed had yet to design a carrier plane from the ground up, and needed help. So they teamed up with Ling Temco Vought, LTV, the creators of the A-7 Corsair II and F-8 Crusader, not to mention the World War II and Korean War F-4AD Corsair I. For new anti-submarine gear, they got help from Sperry Univac Federal Systems, the merger's predecessor, Sperry, being the creators of the Artificial Horizon and other instruments. They designed the onboard computers, sensors, and sonobuoy systems. Surprisingly, the Lockheed proposal was said to be the most promising, and ended up winning the VSX program. Let's take a closer look at what the program became, the S-3A Viking. Sadly for some, like I mentioned before, this plane moved away from the big spinning blades of death to big sucking fans of death, to General Electric TF-34 GE2 turbofan engines. A turbofan engine works just like our classic turbojets we've been talking about, except for an added extra stage, where instead of all the air being sent to the combustion chamber to mix with fuel, some of it is pushed through an extra fan outside of the engine, contributing to even more thrust as the compacted air is pushed out at rapid speeds. These engines were the same engines used on the A-10 Warthog, just tuned to run a little hotter for working on boats. Being high bypass, the engines were best for low altitude, and that's where the S-3 Viking would work best, skimming the wavetops. In fact, any altitude above 24,000 feet would give the engines horrible fuel economy. And they were originally designed to outperform in comparison to its fast jet counterparts. Additionally, the engines never earned the A-10 a nickname like this plane. More on that soon. A 2 in the front, 2 in the back, side-by-side cockpit layout was used like seen on the EA-6B Prowler. While our anti-submarine warfare series, Grumman Tracker and the Grumman Guardian, had a steering wheel-like control column like on the P-38 Lightning, the S-3 would move to the more modern stick to help control pilot steering. One would be provided for both front seaters. The wingspan of the S-3 was an amazing 69 feet, and its tail was 23 feet, sitting large like Poseidon on his seat, watching over the ocean. Much like the S-3 would do. Another upgrade, compared to the earlier Grumman-made planes, was that all 4 crew sat on Douglas Escape Pack 00 ejection seats. If you remember from our Cougar episode, 00 ejection seats would allow a pilot to escape from a jet sitting on the ground, 0 altitude, and at 0 airspeed, giving it the name of 00 ejection seat. The 2 back seaters would be ejected, followed by the front seater half a second later. Each seat was aimed slightly outward in its respective seating direction, left or right. The crew would go through the canopy, like the A6 intruder, leaving no delay for canopy ejection. My dad, being an A6 pilot, would mention some stories of crews ejecting, and my only fear at the time thinking of the story was getting shards of glass in me. It wasn't until I started flying I realized there's probably more pressing concerns at the moment you're ejecting than getting some cuts from shards of glass. Now here's where I'm going to do a little part where I'm going to break down some specific technological upgrades of the S-3 Viking compared to the earlier propeller-driven S-2 tracker, besides just the engines and cockpit layout. Each piece of equipment in the S-2 was an individual instrument, making it packed full of gear. These recordings by sensors would be inscribed on paper, and the maps would be physical paper maps tracked with a mechanical caliper. As the production years for the S-3 were from 1974 to 1978, they were before GPS and would rely heavily on inertial navigation. The AN/ASN-92 inertial navigation system used a mix of TACAN, which is a ground-based system that directs you to a ship or airbase, and Doppler radar. This radar would bounce microwave signals off of moving targets like an aircraft carrier or another ship, and would measure the displacement of the signal upon its return to calculate the exact speed of the inputted vessel. The S-2 tracker had a retractable radome operated in the X-band with a range of 37 nautical miles or 42 land miles. The original S-3 Viking would be set with a radar in the nose, like most modern jets. A AN/APS sea search radar also operating on the X-band. But it had a range of 150 nautical miles or 70 miles, almost 4 times the range of the S-2 tracker's retractable radar. The X-band operates with shorter wavelengths, allowing for higher resolution imagery, not to mention X-band requires much smaller antennas compared to other bands, making it an extremely common option for ships and submarines. The AN/APR-78 sonobuoy receiver connected to and communicated with the 60 sonobuoys on board compared to the tracker's 32 on later models. 59 tactical anti-ship sonobuoys and a single SAR, or search and rescue sonobuoy, would be aboard. In the case of a downed aircrew, the SAR sonobuoy would be dropped. When reaching the water, it would float and emit a radio frequency for rescue. These sonobuoys would be carried in a dispenser on the belly of the jet. When looking at her, it's a clearly visible panel with many holes like a slice of Swiss cheese. The cheese holes are where the sonobuoys would be stored, right in front of the tailhook. The sonobuoy receiver system gave extremely accurate positioning of the sonobuoys by using the 13 different antennas located around the aircraft for the system. If we keep going forward on the jet from the sonobuoy dispenser, we would find the bomb bay. While the S-3 didn't have much of a difference in carry weight from the S-2 tracker, only a 100-pound increase in the Viking's favor at 4,900 pounds, 4,800 for the tracker. The S-2 tracker could only carry torpedoes and mines in its bomb bay, compared to the S-3, which would have 6 internal hardpoints allowing for many different weapons capabilities compared to the tracker. The S-3 definitely excelled the tracker in its ordnance carried, but we will get back to this later on. Going out to the wings, this is one area the S-2 would succeed, having 6 hardpoints compared to the Viking's 4. The wings themselves were slightly swept, meaning pointed slightly backwards and being square. Going back to the fact that the S-3 and A-10 have the same engines, one fact you'll hear many people mention about the A-10 General Electric TF-34 is it was designed to allow the A-10 to loiter over the battlefield for a long time. Loitering is the ability to stay in one area for a long amount of time. For aircraft, it's great, but when I loiter in the kitchen while my roommates are cooking, well, not so much. While the A-10 loitered over battlefields, the S-3 Viking was designed to loiter over the sea on long patrols, waiting for the ability to hunt down an enemy ship or submarine. A non-afterburning turbofan engine will burn less fuel than the typical turbojet, or afterburning turbojet like on the F-35. The S-3 engines could be compared to a family SUV in eco mode, while my Pratt & Whitney F-135 could be considered that of a Bugatti. The S-3, with its non-afterburning turbofan engines mounted under the wings, along with the long square wings, allowed for a long loiter time, with a capability of unrefueled flights lasting 6 hours. While the S-2 had the capability of a 9-hour loiter time, the S-3 could do a flight in half the time due to its increased speeds. The wings of the S-3 Viking also featured leading-edge flaps and trailing-edge Fowler flaps that would extend downwards from the wing, providing lift to the aircraft even at slow speeds. When walking upwards the wing from the outer flaps, don't actually walk on them, it clearly tells you not to step on the wing, you'll see spoilers. All these control surfaces, like on the A6 Intruder, are used to help make landing on carriers easier and more controlled by adding more maneuverability at low speeds. Being as LTV helped with the design of the S-3 Viking, the nose gear was derived from that of an A7 Corsair, while the main gears were that of F8 Crusader. Both being Navy landing gear, they were built to be able to take a punch as pilots land fast and stop quick on the short decks of carriers, catching the wire and screeching to a halt. This process by some pilots can simply be described as slamming the jet down on a carrier. Let's take a closer look at the brave men and women who served on the S-3 Viking. The front two seats were manned by a pilot on the left, or naval aviator as they're called in the U.S. Navy. His job was to fly the jet for the crew and take off and land on carriers. That's how he made his money. Sitting to the right of the pilot is the NFO, or Naval Flight Officer. Another NFO sat directly behind him. The front seat NFO on the right had the jobs of communication and navigation using the AN/ASN 92 Inertial Navigation System, or INS. While he has a control stick like the pilot, he never really performed much flying. Some front seat NFOs were private pilots in their free time and wouldn't mind some hours at the stick during easygoing moments. Everybody on board was a commissioned officer except the back left seater. He was an enlisted Navy air crewman, specializing in sonar technology. This back seater is named a senso, or sensor operator. Along with the sonoboys, he also would sometimes run the FLIR pod, or radar, which is housed on the port or left side of the jet in the belly, right behind where the pilot sat. It was tucked up inside the jet behind a door, but when it was needed to be used, the door would extend out like a landing gear door and the FLIR sensor would drop down. FLIR means forward-looking infrared. Most surveillance FLIR pods mounted on aircraft kind of look like R2-D2's head and spin on about 180 degrees axis horizontally and laterally. A bit more range than a B-17 belly turret. I'll talk more about the FLIR in a second, but we have to cover the back right seat, the Naval Flight Officer. His job as the TACO, or Tactical Coordinator, was to be the playmaker. He's the one who fought the jet. His job was weapons deployment and tactics and oversaw everybody else's operations. In fact, if anybody got too busy, he could help take over their job. Almost every system on the jet could be shared with everybody on a digital screen on the left of everybody's instrument panels called a multi-purpose display. While nowhere near as advanced as my F-35's display screen, I can always appreciate a good old green CRT display. In fact, your laptop or mobile device, on which you could be listening to this, has a comparable amount of more computing power than a CRT. A CRT, or cathode ray tube computer, is a computer powered by vacuum tubes using a beam of electrons to create the images shown on a screen. One cool feature is that even though the computers on the Jet were first designed way back in the 60s, once a certain target was being tracked by the Jet's electronics, the computer would take inputs from the plane and move the aircraft directly over the target. This was done by FTP, fly 2 points. Select location inputs would be made by the TACO that would send electrodes to the aircraft systems, actually putting the TACO in charge of flying the Jet using his control screen. The backseaters, though, would only have limited visibility. Just 2 postage stamp shaped windows were allotted, hoping the backseaters' focus would be mainly on their displays. Let's get back to that FLIR. On the S-3 Viking, a FLIR, or as I said, a forward-looking infrared, is a camera using thermal heat waves to draw a picture of what the camera is pointing at. The reason the FLIR relies on thermal imaging is due to it being a reliable source almost 24/7 at day and night, while the average camera can't pick up accurate video at night. FLIR has had many different uses throughout the years, including helping with navigation, target identification, night ops, and even UFO encounters. As in 2004, 2005, 2014, and 2019, on 4 separate occasions, U.S. naval pilots flying either Legacy or Super Hornets recorded mysterious, unidentified flying objects on their FLIR pods doing almost aerobatically impossible maneuvers. These videos are called the Pentagon UFO videos and were, in 2021, released and confirmed to be real by the U.S. Pentagon. Today's star of the show, the Viking, had a built-in FLIR, like seen on aircraft such as the A6E Tram and OV-10D Plus Broncos in the nose. My plane, the F-35A Lightning II, has a FLIR built into its EOTS pod, electro-optical targeting system, a sapphire gemstone window seen on the bottom of the Jet housing it, and many other systems. Some aircraft which did not have built-in FLIRs, like the earlier mentioned Hornets, would carry a pod device under the aircraft which housed the FLIR. Now let's cover a few more systems on this aircraft. If you've listened to my earlier anti-submarine warfare aircraft episodes in this series, you will know this one very well. Being housed in the back of the tail of the aircraft and extending to a massive 20 feet, the Magnetic Anomaly Detector, or MAD for short, is a device housed on many submarine hunting aircraft. It detects changes in the Earth's magnetic field. The MAD was housed in a fiberglass rod that extended with the MAD when it deployed. Some crews would affectionately give the MAD boom the nickname Donkey Dick. The S-3 Viking was equipped with its own APU, or auxiliary power unit, making startup easy by just flicking a switch in the cockpit, compared to other jet aircraft that would need a start cart to be hauled over and connected to the Jet. The ALE-3 countermeasure system on the Jet allowed it to carry 90 rounds of chaff or flares, or expendable jammers. Chaff are metal strips that reflect radar and would be used to stop radar tracking missiles, while flares burn hot and can sometimes trick a heat-seeking missile. Expendable jammers are used like chaff. It confuses the enemy's radar, leaving it unusable. How many people listening have used a radio to communicate before? I'm sure many. You know that when you talk, at the same time somebody else comes to talk, and then nothing comes through the radio because you're blocking each other's signals? That's kind of what jamming is like, by sending an interference relay, or sometimes many, on the same frequency the enemy's radar is using. The prototype YS-3A had its first flight on January 21st, 1972, flown by test pilot John Christensen. Surprisingly, The flight testing period didn't experience any serious problems that need to be mentioned. And 2 years later, the S-3 Viking would enter the naval fleet. First to receive her on February 20th, 1974, were Anti-Submarine Warfare Squadron VS-41, the Shamrocks, while based at NAS North Island in California, which was formed to fly the S-3 Viking and was not a transfer squadron. They covered both the Pacific and Atlantic Fleet until more squadrons could be founded or transferred. VS-21, the Fighting Redtails, would be the first to take her on a cruise in 1975 when the first S-3 Vikings operated off a sea-bound carrier. Brian often mentions how you could tell how pilots liked their aircraft they flew by the names they gave to it. Due to its General Electric TF-34 engines that would hum and periodically switch tones, kind of like a vacuum cleaner, pilots and crews started to refer to her as the Hoover or War Hoover. Now, some of you might get turned off at the thought of flying a vacuum into combat, but let's wait till the end before we place any judgments. The Viking would have mid-air refueling capabilities, taking fuel from another jet. Typically, the Navy used probe and drogue, in which the aircraft receiving fuel has a built-in refueling probe. Sometimes they'd be fixed, like on the A-6 Intruder or E-2C Hawkeye, but most other jets in today's Star had an extendable probe, in kind of an unusual position. It would deploy from behind a door on the top of the canopy, in between the pilot and co-pilot. We will provide a photo of this. It kind of looks like a small unicorn horn coming out of the jet. So this aircraft that receives the fuel is the probe part in probe and drogue. The drogue part is a basket extending usually back from a refueling aircraft or buddy tank. A buddy tank is just a refueling tank that has the basket built into the back. So you can deploy the basket behind the jet where the aircraft receiving fuel would come up and place his probe in the drogue. Having the probe between the pilot and co-pilot, I'm sure, helped with lining up the probe into the basket, as most jets with extending probes have them on the right side of the jet, like the A-7 Corsair, F-14 Tomcat, and FA-18 Legacy Hornet and Super Hornet. The Air Force does things differently. They have what's called the flying boom method. A plane, usually dedicated for refueling, has the probe attached to the refueling plane, but it's much larger and can be moved by a crew operator in the plane called a boom operator. In the KC-10 and KC-135, they would be in the back of the plane looking exactly at the plane they're refueling, controlling the boom into the drogue. The drogue is usually the aircraft itself. A door will open on the aircraft, allowing the probe to enter a line that runs to the fuel tanks and fill it up with fuel. The main differences between these two methods is who's the probe and who's the metaphorical basket. The flying boom does most of the work, while in the Navy it's the pilot receiving. This does not mean it's easy though. In both cases, the pilots have to fly behind the refueling aircraft in a steady pattern, either allowing the boom operator to do his work or slowly moving your probe into the basket if you're Navy. Just for clarity, the S-3 Viking used the probe and drogue or probe and basket method. While funnily enough, the jets didn't have troubles during flight testing, it did have some technical difficulties once it reached the carrier. The integrated flight screens for all crew were so advanced, allowing all workstations to be shared with other crew, and let's not forget all the technology I rambled off, but it was so ahead of its time it would sometimes compute beyond its own power. They were all powered by a main computer that fed all the stations for the crew. This computer would sometimes dump while the aircraft was getting ready to launch from the carrier, causing the crew to take a few minutes to restart the system and hope it wouldn't crash again. Also, the Navy, due to surprisingly underspending on parts for maintenance, ended up running into parts shortages during these first few cruises, affecting the aircraft's mission readiness capabilities. Another early problem involved multiple mishaps of the jet going into an uncommanded lateral hard over while launching off the carrier. Imagine you just got launched off the carrier at the extreme speeds and extreme forces it puts on your body just for the jet to tip upside down facing the water. That's horribly scary to think about. Of the survivors of these early mishaps, it was only the backseaters, as they had that early split second of ejection before the pilot and navigator. In 1987, the Navy upgraded most of their S-3 Viking A's to the S-3 Viking B's. In its short production run, only lasting 4 years after 1974, 187 S-3 Viking A's were produced. 119 would be swapped into the B variant. The focus of the upgrade was swapping the role of Viking from anti-submarine warfare to anti-surface warfare, which focused more on anti-shipping operations. In this change, much of the submarine detection hardware was removed. Over several 100 pounds of it, including the sonobuoy detectors, which were removed. So the sonobuoy dispensers had banking plates welded over. While this sounds like a lot of loss, when we talk about new variants, there usually isn't loss without gain. And here there was debatably much gain. The avionics were upgraded, and the AN/APS-116 search radar were replaced with a new modern AN/APS-137 inverse synthetic aperture radar. Older jets like the F-4 Phantom would use a pulse Doppler radar. It transmits short singular pulses which will hit the target and measure the returns from the pulse to get an exact range of the target. Imagine you're in a cave. It's dark and you can't see anything. You shout out, "Hello!" Hello. And it echoes off a wall near you and you can tell how far away it is. Inverse synthetic aperture radar, or ISAR, sends out many more pulses in many more directions at once, kind of like a disco ball. And its many pulses make photos of the target, which are combined together to give exact distance, speed, and changes of course direction. Going back to our cave analogy, with ISAR, instead of standing in the same place shouting at that one wall, you are spinning in a circle shouting, "Hello." It gives you an echo off the wall to your left, right, in front of you, and behind you, forming a clear photo in your head of the exact layout of that cave. With the addition of ISAR, the S-3B Viking could track many more targets at once than if it had a normal pulse radar. The crew of the S-3 Viking would use a general search scan that would find the target, usually a ship, and then would switch over to a mode that would track an individual target. This individual target photo would just show a blob, and because of it moving, it was pretty hard to read what it was. But good radar operators with much practice could start to make sense of what they were seeing and could tell the difference between a cruiser, tanker, or container ship. One mishap, though, is when the radar is set to paint that exact target, it would sometimes scare the radar operator as it would appear as a missile targeting radar. The radar had a range of 200 miles and could even track periscopes popping up through the water, allowing the Viking to excel at surface warfare. I'd like to stop here to thank someone who has been helping me a lot and giving me a bunch of great information for this episode. 03 Lieutenant Chris Cree. He was active Navy for 10 years as a naval flight officer on the S-3B Viking, part of the famous VS-30 Diamond Cutters. You could tell this squadron's S-3 Vikings apart from any other due to its tail rudder featuring 4 diamonds on it. And sometimes the CAG bird, or Carrier Air Group plane, would have the whole rudder painted insignia red. They were a transfer squadron from the S-2 Tracker. He shares this story with me that has to do with this ISR radar. Open quote. "The radar was truly impressive. A trained operator could tell from 200 miles away whether a target was a cruiser, a fishing boat, a tanker, or a container ship, etc. A lot of times we could even tell the specific class of warships when they had distinct characteristics. One time we flew into Naples to pick up a couple of Air Force generals. The 4-star sat up front where we had dual controls, and I shifted to the back seat next to the 3-star. I was going through our systems with the general, showing what we could do. So I fired up the radar and found a FFG-7 Perry-class frigate. I explained the blobs in the radar display and why it was an FFG-7 class. He wasn't seeing it and wasn't convinced. So he switched to the primary intercom channel and asked the 4-star up front what kind of ship he saw on that bearing. Our credibility went way up when he confirmed it was an FFG-7 class. Of course, while my radar work was spot on, it never occurred to him that I'd also flown over it less than 20 minutes earlier on our way into Naples to pick him up. Definitely boosts confidence in your radar work when you've seen your target with your eyes first. Close quotes. 03 Lieutenant Chris Cree, thank you, sir, for all your help. He shared this story and answered all my relentless questions, deep diving into the Viking to hopefully represent her properly. Before we dive even deeper into the B, as this is the variant that has the most naval service, let's quickly cover a few other variants and modifications made to the Viking. Our earlier episode in this series, the S-2 Tracker's airframe was so versatile it led to the plane serving in many different roles, including cargo transport, VIP transport, and AWACS, or Airborne Warning and Control System, with the big dish on its back. The US-3A is an S-3A Viking modified for transport, carrying 6 passengers or 4,680 pounds of cargo. This plane was called the COD variant, or Carrier Onboard Delivery variant. Only 6 of the 188 airframes made would be modified into COD Vikings. It was also known by the least affectionate name the Viking will get in this episode, Miss Piggy. With this US-3A Viking, Lockheed saw an opportunity. Grumman had turned its S-2 Tracker into the C-1 Trader COD aircraft. It shared many of the same components, just a larger fuselage. The C-2 Greyhound COD was also developed from Grumman's E-2 Hawkeye AWACS plane. Thinking if they took the same ideas and applied it to the Viking, it could become the next carrier onboard delivery plane, replacing the C-2 Greyhound. The Lockheed COD was originally supposed to have a cargo door in its rear, higher capacity fuselage, and up-rated engines. But the Navy decided the C-2 Greyhound would be okay for the time being, and much longer after that, and stuck with them. But seeing Lockheed's program's value, the Navy asked for 6 examples, just not as modified. 6 testbeds and 1 actual S-3A Viking would be transformed into Miss Piggies. The 2 backseaters would be removed, leaving just the pilot and navigator, and removing all mission-important equipment, leaving room for 6 reconfigurable seats or 4,680 pounds of cargo. These jets had much more flight time than the Greyhound, not to mention the S-3 Viking had the ability to refuel midair, and the Greyhound still does not today. Miss Piggy retained the ability to refuel midair, leading to her having very long legs. The US-3A would be painted in all insignia white, a notable difference between her and the Viking. Another being with 2 small windows forward of the wings on the US-3A or Miss Piggy. When you had to get somewhere as a VIP, this is the jet you wanted to use. These aircraft would have BUNO or bureau numbers 157994, 157995, 157996, 157997, 157998, and 158868. The reason I mention these BUNOs is because their stories are not done. 157-996 would go on to become the test platform for the KS-3A, a dedicated refueling version of the Viking. This jet would have conformal tanks in the weapons bays, extra large drop tanks, plumbing modifications, and a retractable drogue basket. This single 157-996 would go on to refuel every single Navy jet with a probe at the time, before being reverted back to a US-3A. 157-996, keeping its original form as a Miss Piggy, would go on to serve as a helper for the anti-surface and submarine warfare squadrons, the VS-21 Redtails, the VS-47 Sawbucks, the VS-28 Gamblers, and the VS-31 Topcats, helping them haul around people and parts before all 6 US-3A Miss Piggies were sent to the VS-50, a dedicated cargo transport squadron. Sadly, 157-996 would be the only US-3B to be lost, as she stalled and fell into the sea while on approach to Subic Bay's NAS QB Point in the Philippines. The only crew name I can find listed is Lieutenant Thomas Bartman, age 29. He sadly would pass away in the crash, along with his squadron commander, while they were on a check flight. The US-3B helped deliver crew and supplies needed for the Iran hostage crisis, and later on, 2 US-3Bs would serve in the Gulf War, and the fleet of Miss Piggies would be retired shortly after. The Douglas A-3 Sky Warrior was originally designed as a jet that could land and take off from aircraft carriers, and have the ability to carry nuclear weapons. But at the emergence of nuclear-capable ballistic missiles in the early 1960s, the Navy's role as a strategic nuclear force was negated, and the A-3 Sky Warrior would find a new role as an electronic attack aircraft, and serving in this role until the aircraft's retirement in 1991 after the Gulf War. The electronic attack role would therefore need to be replaced, and for this, the ES-3A Shadow or Sea Shadow would be born, ES standing for Electronic Surveillance. It would be an S-3A Viking packed with gear. The backstations usually used for submarine detection on the S-3 Viking were replaced by Ares II, the same electronic attack suite used on the EP-3 Orion. This allowed it to collect information and share it with other aircraft in the fleet, helping them work as a team, kind of like an AWACS plane. While losing its mad boom, the aircraft would feature over 60 bumps, including antennas, sensors, and radars. It was built for electronic reconnaissance in all weathers. 16 S-3 Vikings were converted into ES-3A Sea Shadows, or ELINT Viking Electronic Intelligence Viking. Some capabilities of this plane were tracking, detecting, and locating enemy missile sites. It could pick up enemy phone calls, IEDs, etc. through signal waves and track the exact positioning of them, and if needed, even overload the signal waves the target operates on, stopping a signal being sent to an IED to explode. It could then communicate with other aircraft in the naval fleet, sharing positions of enemies or missile sites, and lead a strike package to hit them, giving them warnings of enemy aircraft or surface-to-air missiles in the vicinity. It also retained the ability of air-to-air refueling using a buddy pod, an external fuel tank made specifically for supplying fuel to other planes, by deploying a net or drogue and hose from the back of the tank for the recipient aircraft to meet its probe with. Buddy refueling is a nice capability, as you don't need to haul a large refueling aircraft on board like a KA-3 Sky Warrior or meet up with a KC-130. It operates in squadrons VQ-5, the Sea Shadows, and VQ-6, the Black Ravens. A cool fact is, while preparing for their cruise in 1998, on board CVN-74, the USS John C. Stennis, a Nimitz-class nuclear carrier named after a U.S. senator, VQ-6 and their EA-3 Shadows would be featured in a TV show about their jets, Discovery Channel's Extreme Machines, focusing on, well, extreme machines. Some of their episodes would cover helicopters, roller coasters, rockets, tanks, and of course, military jets. Season 2's episode 12 covers the John C. Stennis and the aircraft on board, including E-2 Hawkeyes, EA-6B Prowlers, F-14B Tomcats, or Bombcats, FA-18 Legacy Hornets, and of course the S-3B Viking and ES-3B Shadow. This part here will be tricky as it's actually still classified. These Vikings were special variants, usually just one or very few of each type made, and they would carry out specific classified missions. The Grey Wolf was an aircraft specifically designed to hunt and destroy missiles and their launchers using a multi-mode pulse Doppler radar called AN/APG-76, operating on the KU band, which is usually utilized by satellites. It was originally supposed to be placed on the A6F, a proposed modern A6 intruder, but sadly that project was cancelled. I just love those birds, but the radar would be used by the Turks and Israelis in F-4 Phantoms. The radar on the Grey Wolf Vikings would be stored in a modified travel pod carried on the wing and could provide clear imaging of targets at over 100 nautical miles or 115 regular miles. Every 4 seconds, a new image would be displayed showing a map layout of everything scanned and could be freezed to examine further or rotated to look at the map from a different angle on its 10-inch LED screen. The Bear Trap and Aladdin Vikings do not have much public information on them or their systems. While I can't find anything on the Bear Trap, there were about 6 Aladdin Vikings made. It's believed they were modified for missile surveillance and electronic intelligence like the Grey Wolf. It's believed to have dropped some sort of sensors during the Bosnian War. The Calypso Viking was a proposed anti-smuggling variant, but never made it off the drawing board. The Orca Viking was tested for avionics. The Outlaw Viking was designed with a built-in over-the-horizon radar that could also display the battlefield imaging picked up by the radar on a screen. This plane was modified back to S-3B Viking. One Viking wasn't as much modified as it was rebuilt into a test bed for NASA. It had communications with satellites to test their signals, GPS, and weather radars. They also would put research testing equipment into the bomb bays, which along with the weather radars were used for environmental monitoring. The NASA Viking would also help with aviation safety research, aiding the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, help set laws for drone usage. She was first acquired in 2004 and would fly for 16 years after that, as the last flying A-3 as the Navy retired theirs in 2009. NASA's head of command and control, Mike Jarrell, was quoted saying about the Viking, open quotes, "This old aircraft has been a huge part of ushering in the future of aviation. The S-3B has been a perfect match for our research. It has a nice flat bottom where we can mount a variety of antennas. It flies steady and goes low and slow so we can communicate with ground stations." Close quotes. Jarrell would go on to add that the Viking had flown in almost every single terrain in the United States, including mountains, hills, plains, deserts, and where she belongs, out over the sea. Another cool feat by the NASA's S-3 Viking was used to get radar imaging of Lake Erie to track algae growth. The abilities lost in the S-3 MS Vikings are hopefully being retained by NASA's still-standing T-38s. Now that we've covered the variants, we've covered the plane, I think it's time we get into my favorite stuff, weapons and operational history. But the S-3B Viking also had a small number of airframes that would go under an upgrade program which wouldn't get a whole new designation, like the Electronic Intelligence Vikings, ELINTs, and the Miss Piggies. The Viking would just get a stacked-on name, as it was just a minor upgrade. The S-3B SSU stands for an S-3B Viking Surveillance Systems Upgrade, or sometimes called the Super Viking, focused on over-the-horizon surveillance and working to perform with an aircraft network to carry out precision strikes. The typical S-3 Viking carried an AN/APS 137V1, but the SSU got an upgraded version called the 137V5, providing improved surveillance abilities. A newer, better FLIR was placed inside and an upgraded, faster mission computer with better processing and network integrations. It had better threat detection and used its data link abilities to share real-time data with F-18 Hornets and E-2 Hawkeyes. While the normal S-3B communicated through VHF and UHF radio waves, the SSU had the ability of SATCOM, communicating over satellite signals instead of radio. We will cover the S-3B SSU a bit more, so remember her. The Viking's range was 2,700 miles and could be extended by air refueling. The S-3 Viking could also be used heavily for refueling other aircraft, including other Vikings, by using an earlier mentioned buddy pod. While it could ascend at 5,000 feet a minute, its descending is the real capability. The shoulder wing's slight sweep, mixed with the plane's control surfaces like spoilers and air brakes, could allow it to descend at 15,000 feet per minute. And as the Viking only could deploy flares with its ALE-39 countermeasure system, and it had no ability to carry air-to-air weapons, this descending would become the Viking's defense in an engagement. By descending and hugging as close as it could to the waves and applying a max 3.5 G turn of the aircraft's capabilities, the engines could give enough power to maintain that turn until out of fuel. This, in theory, wouldn't allow enemy aircraft to get a radar lock-on in time without going for a swim. And its turbofan engines were running at not warm enough of a temperature for heat-seeking missiles to pick up. While this is just a theory, I'm sure it would work on a good amount of kill-hungry fighter pilots. But I don't think it would work against modern-day heat-seeking missiles like the AIM-9X, which contrasts temperatures to find the odd one out and lock on. In the bomb bay, on its 4 internal hardpoints, the S-3 Viking would carry 2 live Mark 50 and 4 live Mark 46 torpedoes, along with recoverable dummy torpedoes for practice. Another loadout possible was 2 nuclear depth charges like the S-2 Tracker could carry, along with many other anti-submarine aircraft. The weight of the B-57 tactical nuke depth charge is about 500 pounds, and it was 9 feet long, about the same size as a Mark 46 torpedo. It would be usually attached with a parachute, allowing the dropping aircraft to hopefully escape the blast zone, and could be fit with different fuses to blast at different depths. And the explosive yield itself could reach up to equivalents of 10 kilotons of TNT. That sounds like a bad day to be on a submarine. Now moving to its 2 external hardpoints, or also known as wing pylons. While 2 doesn't sound like a lot, the Navy at this time was very fond of using TER, triple ejector racks, and MER, multiple ejector racks. Triples allowed for the attachment of 3 munitions, while multiple ejector racks allowed for anything more than 3, but could also be used for 3 bombs if it helps even out weight distribution beneath the wings. On these racks, the S-3 Viking could carry up to 10 Mark 82 general-purpose unguided 500-pound bombs. on multiple ejector racks, 5 on each rack, or 6 unguided Mark 20 cluster bombs. These are pods that would be dropped and would airburst over the target, spreading 247 tiny bomblets over a spread out area. With the 6 cluster bombs, 2 sets of 3 would go onto 2 triple ejector racks. Also could be fitted were the general-purpose unguided Mark 83 1,000-pound bomb and the Mark 83 2,000-pound bombs. Iron bombs, or general-purpose unguided bombs, could also be carried in the bomb bay if needed. While not exactly a weapon, another thing carried in the bomb bay are pods called blivets in the Navy, or in the Air Force, travel pods. These were empty pods that could be stored with equipment for deployments, air shows, overnight rests, or whatever need may arise. Usually clothing, tools, or for air shows, squadron merch. These blivets also were carried by the U.S. 3A Miss Piggy. Particularly relevant for its role of controlling seaways, the S-3 Viking could also deploy a variety of bottom and moored mines. Bottom mines were handy in shallow water or when hunting a submarine that sat on the sea floor. Moored mines were best for targeting surface vessels as they would float and be held in place by an anchor sitting on the bottom of the sea. These are the ones you usually see depicted in movies and video games with big spiky points. The Mark 36 Destructor mine was usually carried in the bomb bay due to its smaller size. It's basically a 500-pound bomb with a fuse activated by acoustic activity nearby, or sticking to the ship magnetically before exploding. Up to 4 could be carried internally, 2 in each bomb bay, or on the wings carried on triple ejector racks. It is designated for shallow water use on the bottom. Quick strike mines are bottom mines that use a special fuse that knows when a ship is coming by and strikes at its optimal moment instead of first, like most mines. They are based on the general-purpose Mark 80 series of bombs, specifically the 82, 83, and 84, which are 500, 1,000, and 2,000-pound bombs, respectively. The Mark 62 Quick Strike mine, based off the Mark 82 500-pound, and the Mark 63 Quick Strike, based off the 1,000-pound Mark 83 bomb, could be carried externally, while the Mark 64 Quick Strike, based on the Mark 84 2,000-pound bomb, had to be carried externally and only 1 per pylon. The Mark 52 mine is a magnetic, acoustic, or pressure-activated 1,200-pound bottom mine, typically carried internally, used for harbor denial, and deeper water targets. 2 can be carried in the bomb bay, or 1 per pylon externally. The Mark 55, also carried, is an upgraded Mark 52 with better detection capabilities. The Mark 56 is a moored mine that is influence activated, meaning it usually only explodes when contact is made, but can be fitted with an acoustic or magnetic fuse. This mine was 2,000 pounds and was carried externally, 1 per pylon. Now, if all that sounds pretty fun to you, that's just the unguided munitions. 2 AGM-65E or F variant Maverick missiles could also be attached. These air-to-ground missiles consist of a 300-pound warhead and are almost 8 feet long. They would use imaging guidance to hit targets. A backseater uses a display showing what the Maverick is seeing and can guide the missile directly onto its target, as long as the aircraft still has guidance. It could be fitted with a direct impact fuse or delayed to help it penetrate armor before exploding. My favorite naval weapon, thankfully, is carried by the Viking, so I get to cover it. The AGM-84 SLAM, otherwise known as Harpoon, the earlier variant for water vessel targeting, was a subsonic missile designed to be deployed at distances up to 130 nautical miles or 150 real miles away from its target. This gives safe standoff capability, meaning you can usually strike the target without going into ranges of his defenses. The AGM-84 SLAM is a whopping 14 feet long and has a 500-pound explosive warhead. Capable of traveling at 500 miles per hour, it is designed to hit high-value targets, or capable of taking out ships, as seen in Operation Praying Mantis when deployed by A-6E tram intruders against Iranian naval ships. The SLAM had limitations, though, like it had to have a direct line of fire to its target, not being able to distinguish terrain getting in its way. And it couldn't strike moving targets as it required a lock on a laser guidance spectrum rather than a picture target guidance system. One remedy to this was to carry a AWW-13 data link pod that would link communications between the S-3 and the early 84 Harpoon SLAM missile. But since the pod itself takes up a pylon, only one Harpoon could be carried. It was replaced by the SLAM ER, or Slammer, which the S-3 could also carry too. It has a range of 155 nautical or 178 real miles and has an 800-pound warhead. Using GPS, it overcame many issues with the AGM-84 SLAM being able to strike stationary and moving targets. Using GPS and allowing movement of the missile while in flight like the AGM-65. Something also carried on the wing pylons was the ADM-141 TALD, Tactical Air Launched Decoy. The TALD is shaped with a square section fuselage that tapers out into a horizontal line near a blunt nose and rear. When launched, it deploys wings that flip out like a switchblade. The rear has 3 small control surfaces, giving the effects of where a tail and elevators would be. The original A model of the TALD was an unassisted glider, but if launched from high altitude, about 40,000 feet, it would have a flight time of 7 minutes and could travel up to 78 miles. When the TALD was deployed, the crews would report ducks away, as my S-3 pilot friend Chris earlier mentioned was telling me. He wasn't a big fan of TALD deployment due to it not being something with bombs or radar, and would sometimes jokingly say a play on words of duck off. I'll provide one of his awesome patches in the photos on Patreon associated with this episode. The SSU surveillance system upgraded to the S-3 Viking, otherwise known as the Super Viking, had an upgraded weapons suite and underwent testing to be able to deploy Joint Direct Attack Munitions, or JDAMs. A JDAM is a free-fall iron bomb that has been attached with a special kit, turning it into a guided bomb. The difference between this and a GBU, or guided bomb unit, is that the GBU comes pre-made as a guided bomb, while the JDAM can be used as a field modification to turn any simple general-purpose bomb into a guided bomb. If I had to guess, I'd say these were mounted on the wing tips due to the limited space in the bomb bay. While there was testing, it's not known if they were used in combat. Thank you guys for joining me this week on Tanner's Just Jets. As an aviator, I know that every takeoff is optional, every landing is mandatory, and I appreciate you sticking around to wheels down. But this is just a touch and go, as we've just started to cover the glorious S-3 Viking. Next week, we're going to go over the numerous combat deployments of the S-3 Viking and maybe some other interesting stories while we're at it. If you join me back here. See you guys next week. Tanner signing off.